Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to another Trollope Thursday. Yes, that's right, Trollope Thursday is back, and today I'm going to be recommending you Anthony Trollope books based on your favourite classic author. So, if you are very new to this channel, you might not know that earlier in the year I was doing a series called Trollope Thursday where I talked about Anthony Trollope's books every Thursday. Anthony Trollope is a Victorian writer who I really love. He's one of my absolute favourite writers, probably my joint favourite author with Charles Dickens. And earlier in the year I finished reading all of his novels, which is quite a lot because he wrote 47 novels, and I've been making a lot of videos about him since. I put Trollope Thursday on pause for Jane Austen July, but it's now back as I have a few more videos I want to make about Anthony Trollope, so there will be another few videos about Anthony Trollope over the next month or two, and then I will probably bring Trollope Thursday back every few months / a couple of times a year as and when I reread books by Anthony Trollope is my idea. But for now, today, I'm going to be recommending you Anthony Trollope books based on other classic authors you love. So I've got some recommendations for Trollope books to read if you love Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, the Brontes, and that kind of thing. So I have selected various classic authors to pair with Anthony Trollope. A lot of them are Victorian, but they're not all Victorian. I think I've got 20, maybe 21 authors to pair with Anthony Trollope. I did ask on BookTube sort of what authors people would like me to pair with Anthony Trollope, so I have gone with some people's suggestions as well as some of my own. And I've tried to have a sort of varied mix of authors, but they are all classic authors. A few people did request contemporary authors, but I struggle to think of like the right Anthony Trollope recommendations for contemporary authors. It's not that I think you won't love Anthony Trollope if you mostly read contemporary books, but I just found it harder to like pair with specific Trollope novels. So I've gone with all classic authors, and some of these authors I have sort of multiple Anthony Trollope recommendations for, some I just have one, but these are all authors where if you like them, I think you might like Anthony Trollope, or at least find some books amongst Anthony Trollope's big body of work that you will like. And I suppose also the recommendations work the other way around. If you like particular Anthony Trollope books, or if you like Anthony Trollope, these are also authors I think you will like. So let me get into the books. So we'll start off with Jane Austen, and I have actually done a whole separate video recommending you Anthony Trollope books based on your favourite Jane Austen novel, so I'll leave that link down below too. But I have two main recommendations for books by Anthony Trollope to read if you love Jane Austen. The first is Isla's Angel, which is a really wonderful Anthony Trollope standalone. It's about two sisters who, after the death of their parents, are separated and go to live with different relations, and one sister has someone she really wants to marry who no one around her approves of her wanting to marry, and the other sister doesn't want to marry any of her suitors despite having many eligible suitors around her that people are trying to persuade her to marry. And it's just a fantastic love story as well as a wonderful sister story, and I just love it very much. I think you will really enjoy Isla's Angel if you like Jane Austen. But I also wanted to recommend Miss Mackenzie for Jane Austen fans. This is a sweet, quieter Anthony Trollope novel about a slightly older heroine. I think she's in her late 30s, which, you know, for a Victorian novel is an older heroine. Miss Mackenzie has never really had any prospect of marriage, but after the death of her brother, she inherits some money, and suddenly lots of people want to marry her, and this is a slightly new world for her. And it's just a really wonderful, lovely novel that I highly recommend, and I think you will enjoy if you like Jane Austen. Next, sticking with the Georgians, if you like the author Sir Walter Scott, I would like to recommend to you Anthony Trollope's novel La Vendée, which is, I think, Anthony Trollope's only historical novel, or at least it is his most historical novel. I guess there are some of his books that are set like a few decades before they were written, but not like as far before. Anyway, La Vendée is set during the French Revolution and examines the counter-revolution that took place in La Vendée in the 1790s, and is an interesting, powerful novel with quite a lot more drama and military stuff than you would usually expect in an Anthony Trollope novel. I'll be honest, it's not my favourite, but I think that if you like Sir Walter Scott and like that kind of historical fiction, I think you will enjoy La Vendée. Next, some recommendations for Bronte fans. If you like Charlotte Bronte, I would like to recommend you the Anthony Trollope novel John Caldergate. John Caldergate is a really interesting novel. We're following a young man called John Caldergate. At the beginning of the book, he goes out to Australia to try and make his fortune. He later comes back, and we follow his life on his return and how certain events in his past in Australia influence his life on his return. And there is a particular thing about John Caldergate that really reminded me of a particular Charlotte Bronte novel, and I'm not going to say what and why I think you would like John Caldergate if you'd like Charlotte Bronte, because I think it would spoil a Charlotte Bronte book and John Caldergate, but I do think that if you're a big Charlotte Bronte fan, John Caldergate will really interest you. And if you like Emily Bronte, I would like to recommend you An Eye for an Eye. Finally have a physical book to show you here. An Eye for an Eye is a really wonderful, very slim Anthony Trollope standalone. I feel like I can't keep saying standalones for every standalone. They're mostly standalones in this video. I will make it clear if it's part of a series. Anyway, An Eye for an Eye is a really wonderful, thin Anthony Trollope novel that is quite a bit darker than quite a lot of his books, which is why I think it is a good match for Emily Bronte. An Eye for an Eye tells the story of a young man who finds himself torn between two women. There is the woman that his family would like him to marry, who is of his own class, and then there is an Irish Catholic girl who he has fallen in love with in Ireland, who he knows his upper class Protestant family would not approve of. And in many ways, the sort of initial setup feels very like many an Anthony Trollope book, but there is this darkness hanging over the book, partly because of the title, but also because the prologue takes place in an asylum, and you know that something is going to go very wrong for some of the characters, and it's just a really dark, clever book. And I think the sort of wildness and drama of this book is something that will appeal to you if you like Emily Bronte. Then if you like Anne Bronte, I would like to recommend you He Knew Who Was Right. I would say this is mostly a recommendation for if you love The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, because He Knew Who Was Right, like The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, is a novel that really looks at marriage and the Victorian institution of marriage. Both The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and He Knew Who Was Right look really interestingly at power dynamics within marriage in the Victorian period, and I think that they are two books that are quite interesting to look at side by side. And I think they are books that would potentially pair well together. He Knew Who Was Right is the story of the breakdown of a marriage. Two young people get married, they love each other, things are going well until suddenly they are not. And we follow the breakdown of his marriage as well as various other plot lines. It's quite a long book and one of my absolute favourites. It's a really splendid novel that I highly, highly recommend. And I think it is worth a read if you're a fan of Anne Bronte. Next, I have some recommendations for people who love Mary Elizabeth Braddon and Wilkie Collins, or sort of Victorian sensation fiction in general. I've picked out some of the more sort of sensational Anthony Trollope novels for you. So the first recommendation I have is Can You Forgive Her, which is the first book in the Palliser series. And Can You Forgive Her is a really interesting novel about a young woman, Alice, who is engaged to a nice young man, and there's nothing wrong with him, but she just isn't sure whether she should marry him. And she is increasingly thinking that maybe she would rather marry her cousin George. And everything goes on from there. But Can You Forgive Her goes in lots of directions that you don't expect, and gets very dramatic at various points. So I feel it is a novel that you might enjoy if you like Mary Elizabeth Braddon or Wilkie Collins. I also wanted to recommend Lady Anna, which is another like slightly more dramatic, pacey Anthony Trollope novel, or at least there are certain sections of it that are quite dramatic and pacey. Lady Anna is the story of a young woman whose birth is under scrutiny. She is the daughter of a nobleman, but whether she is his legitimate or his illegitimate daughter has been called into question, and this sort of affects her material position in life very dramatically. She's got engaged to a working class man, a tailor, whom she loves, but if she is the legitimate daughter of this nobleman, then society would not think it appropriate for her to marry this man, but if she's his illegitimate daughter, society doesn't care. And there is another higher class man who is possibly interested in her too, and everything goes on from there, but it goes in sort of darker, more dramatic directions than you might expect in places. So I think it's one you might enjoy if you like sensation fiction. And finally, I also wanted to recommend John Caldergate again, which I know I have already recommended, but I do think that John Caldergate is a very, very pacey Anthony Trollope novel, so I think it's one you might enjoy if you like sensation fiction, and it also deals with some issues that sometimes get looked at in sensation fiction. Anthony Trollope does not write sensation novels, like that's not what he's doing, but there are certainly some of his novels that have borrowed elements from sensation fiction, and John Caldergate is very pacey. Like, I think it is one of the Anthony Trollope novels I've read the fastest, with like, you know, turning the pages, desperate to see what happens kind of feeling. So I feel like that is one you might enjoy if you like sensation fiction as well. Next, I have some Trollope books to recommend you if you love Charles Dickens, the first of which is The Way We Live Now. This, to me, in many ways, is Anthony Trollope's like most Dickensian novel. It is a big novel with a lot of different characters, following a lot of different plots that all sort of interweave. It's set in London, and it really looks at like capitalism and corruption, and the sort of grittier side of London life. All of that really reminds me of Dickens, but also the structure of the novel, the length of it, all those plots weaving together, like it feels very, very Dickensian to me. And some of the characters, you know, Mr. Melmotte feels like he could appear in a Dickens novel too. The two Dickens novels this reminds me the most of are Our Mutual Friend and Little Dorrit. I think if you love those two books, you will probably get a lot out of The Way We Live Now and find it really interesting. Like Our Mutual Friend, this book looks at money and marriage a lot. Like Little Dorrit, it looks at capitalism and sort of wealthy figures within Victorian society and their position, and it's just a really fantastic novel. I haven't really explained what it's about, I've just named lots of themes, but The Way We Live Now follows a lot of different characters who are all kind of drawn together by this man called Mr. Melmotte, who has appeared in London with a massive fortune. No one knows how he's made his money. He definitely has a lot more wealth than class, but everyone wants a piece of his fortune, everyone wants a piece of the pie, so everyone flocks towards him, and we follow kind of everyone around him, and it's just really, really good. This is my favourite Anthony Trollope novel. Is it, or is that The Small House at Allington? Who can say? It's one of my absolute favourites. It's wonderful. And then I have one other recommendation for you if you love Charles Dickens, and that is An Old Man's Love. An Old Man's Love is a shorter, focused Anthony Trollope novel, not very Dickensian at all in form and structure, but it is the story of an older man, about 50 years old, who falls in love with a woman in her late 20s. She is fond of him, but she doesn't love him. And there is a man who she loved several years ago, who she hasn't seen for some time. And so she finds herself sort of caught between these two men. An Old Man's Love is not an Anthony Trollope book that everyone loves, but personally, I really like it. I think it's a really powerful, tender story, and one where you just have to trust Anthony Trollope and trust that he knows what he's doing. There is a particular reason why I think you would like An Old Man's Love if you like Charles Dickens. If you have read the Charles Dickens book that makes me think that, you will know what I mean. But if you haven't, you won't. But I also don't want to spoil that Dickens book, so I'm not going to say more. But there is something about An Old Man's Love that reminds me of something in a Dickens book, and I think if you like that Dickens book and you would like that topic explored more, then An Old Man's Love is a really great place to find that. Next, I have some recommendations for you if you like the works of George Eliot. Now, I am not necessarily the person best placed to give you recommendations for if you like George Eliot, because I am personally not a big fan of George Eliot. Her writing style is not really for me, but I do nonetheless have a couple of recommendations. The first of which is The Warden, and basically the whole of the Barsetshire Chronicles. Leaving sort of style aside, because I do feel like George Eliot and Anthony Trollope have just very, very different writing styles. But I think the themes of the Barsetshire Chronicles are themes that would appeal to you if you like George Eliot. The Barsetshire Chronicles are a series of 6 books that take place in the fictional county of Barsetshire, and a lot of the books follow clergymen and look at sort of issues of morality and to what extent clergymen should be held to higher moral standards than other people. And they also look at sort of small town and rural life and provincial life in a really interesting way. And I think all of that stuff is stuff that you will find interesting if you like the works of George Eliot. And then I also had one other recommendation for if you like the works of George Eliot, and sort of more specifically if you like the novel Daniel Deronda, and that is Nina Balakar. Nina Balakar is a really interesting, short, focused Anthony Trollope novel that takes place in Prague, and it follows the love story of a Christian woman and a Jewish man who are engaged, who love each other, but their families and their wider communities are very much against them being together, and the book kind of examines anti-Semitism in Prague in the 19th century. I really like Nina Balakar. I think it's a really interesting novel, and I think if you like Daniel Deronda and the way that looks at the Jewish community in the 19th century, I think you will find Nina Balakar a really interesting read. Next, if you like the works of Elizabeth Gaskell, I would like to recommend you the Anthony Trollope novel Marion Fay. To be honest, I feel like there are a lot of different Anthony Trollope books I could recommend if you like Elizabeth Gaskell, partly because I generally think that if you like Gaskell, you'll probably like Trollope, but also because Gaskell writes in a lot of different styles and a lot of different kinds of books. But there's something about Marion Fay that I just think you'll like if you like Elizabeth Gaskell. Marion Fay is a really wonderful, powerful Anthony Trollope novel that is very close to my heart, that I love very, very much. It tells the story of a brother and sister who are the children of a nobleman, but they both fall in love with people who are sort of from a much lower rank in life than them. The sister falls in love with a post office clerk, and the brother falls in love with a young lower middle class woman called Marion Fay, and the book follows those love stories and lots of other things that come into it later that I can't really explain without spoilers, but I love Marion Fay a great deal, and I think that if you like Elizabeth Gaskell, it's a book you would enjoy. Next, if you like George Gissing, I would like to recommend you The McDermotts of Ballycloran. You might gather by me recommending this for Gissing fans that it is a slightly darker, more sombre Anthony Trollope novel. It's also his debut novel, but one that I really, really love and think is well worth a read. It's set in Ireland in the 1830s and follows a brother and sister, both of whom are sort of led into danger and temptation in very different ways. And we are following this brother and sister and also their local priest, Father John, who is trying as hard as he can to save these young people. It is a very powerful, gritty novel that I think you will like if you like George Gissing because of that grit and that darkness. But I also just think it's a great read that I would highly recommend. Next, I have a recommendation for you if you like the works of Thomas Hardy. So, you know, it's going to be another darker, less cheerful, comforting Anthony Trollope book, and that is Linda Tressel. This is one of Trollope's darker books, and I think it is fantastic. It is a story of Linda Tressel, a young woman who lives with her aunt in Nuremberg. Linda's aunt thinks that Linda should marry their lodger, a man who is several decades older than Linda, who she doesn't like, who she doesn't love, who she sort of physically shrinks from every time he is in the room. Linda's aunt thinks it is Linda's Christian duty to marry this man, and Linda continually refuses. She is in love with another man, and even if she wasn't, she doesn't want to marry Peter, but her aunt will not take no for an answer, and this book is basically, you know, 200 pages of Linda and Peter trying to persuade Linda to marry Peter against her will, and it's horrible. It's a really unpleasant read, but it's so fantastic. I don't know if I'm selling you Linda Tressel here, but it is not the Anthony Trollope book that I enjoyed reading the most, but it is possibly the Anthony Trollope book I have thought about the most since finishing it, and I think it is one of his absolute best books. And I think if you like Thomas Hardy, and if you can cope with the relenting sadness and misery that you sometimes get in some Thomas Hardy novels, I think you will love Linda Tressel and really appreciate what it is trying to do. Next, I have a couple of recommendations for fans of the author H.G. Wells. So I have one recommendation for people who like his science fiction and a different recommendation for people who like his realism. So if you like H.G. Wells' science fiction, I would like to recommend you Anthony Trollope's one work of science fiction, The Fixed Period, a really strange, bizarre novel that is quite an interesting read. The Fixed Period is set in the 1970s, you know, a good 100 years after it was written, and it is set in a former British colony that is somewhere near New Zealand that has become independent and established its own laws, and one of the laws it has is the law of the fixed period, which says that the amount of time that human beings should live is 68 years, and when you get to your 68th birthday, you are euthanized. That is their social law, but they are quite a young country, so they have a few years before the first person in the country reaches the age of 67. And at that point, suddenly they all realise what this law means, and everything goes on from there. It's quite a weird novel, but it is interesting, and if you're interested in science fiction and sort of Victorian conceptions of the future and Victorian ways of like examining contemporary issues by looking at the future, which you probably are if you like H.G. Wells, then I think The Fixed Period could be an interesting work for you. But I also have a recommendation for if you like the realism of H.G. Wells, because I think his realist books are quite different, and that is The Struggles of Jones, Brown and Robinson, which is one of Anthony Trollope's like shorter novels, and it is a story of three men who set up I think it's a haberdashery firm together. I think that's right. The character we're following the most does the marketing and the advertising and is a big fan of false advertising. But we follow the sort of drama of this small business. It's very much a novel about lower middle class life and lower middle class working life and businesses, and looks at the sort of social group that H.G. Wells often looks at in his realism. And it has a sort of like dark sense of humour that sometimes you get in H.G. Wells' realism too. It's another slightly different Anthony Trollope book, but one that I really enjoyed. That's been quite a lot of Victorian authors, so now I have some non-Victorian authors to mention. If you like the works of E.M. Forster, I would like to recommend you the Anthony Trollope book Cousin Henry. Cousin Henry begins with an old man who doesn't know how to leave his property. He is torn between leaving it to his nephew or his niece. He loves and trusts his niece, and feels that she would do a better job with the property, but in his heart he is old-fashioned and conservative, and he believes that land should be inherited by men, and he feels that perhaps he has a duty to leave his land to his nephew Henry, even though Henry is not a great guy. And we follow what happens after this man's death and everything that goes on from there. I don't precisely know how to explain why I think this is a book you will like if you like the works of E.M. Forster. I just think it is. There's just something about it. There's just a vibe. Maybe it's the complicated, messy characters. Maybe it's the fact that the book doesn't necessarily go in the way you expect, but there's just something about it that I think means you would enjoy it if you like Ian Forster. Next, if you like the author Victor Hugo, I would like to recommend you Anthony Trollope's novel Castle Richmond. Castle Richmond is set in Ireland during the Great Hunger of the 1840s, and it focuses on two families, both of whom are upper class, and in some ways are not affected by the famine, but in other ways they are. And the Great Hunger is sort of constantly in the background of the novel all the way through. It's a novel with a love triangle in it, with scandals and secrets, but in the background behind all of it is the social problems of Ireland and the great poverty and desperation that so many people are in. And that is, I think, something you'll find really interesting if you like the works of Victor Hugo. And sticking with French authors, if you like the works of Alexander Dumas, I would like to recommend you An Eye for an Eye, which I know I mentioned earlier and recommended for Emily Bronte, but I just think it's a great novel. And both Emily Bronte and Alexander Dumas liked a revenge tale, and this, I think, comes the closest to that. I've already explained what this book is about, but I do think it's a novel you'll enjoy if you enjoy the works of Alexander Dumas. Next, if you like the works of P.G. Wodehouse, I would like to recommend you Anthony Trollope's novel The Three Clerks. This is one of Anthony Trollope's early works, and it looks at three clerks who all work in the civil service in London, at their romantic relationships and their various scrapes and escapades they get into. One of them wants to be a writer as well, which is a really fun element of the book. And it's just a really great Anthony Trollope novel that I very, very much enjoy. I'd say that it's definitely one of Anthony Trollope's funnier novels, which is why I have recommended it for if you like P.G. Wodehouse. And there's a lot of like young men getting into scrapes, which, you know, feels quite P.G. Wodehouse-esque, but there are definitely some darker moments too. It's a really great novel and one I would highly recommend. When I was asking which authors I should include in this video, someone asked for recommendations of which Anthony Trollope novel to read if you love Agatha Christie, which I found slightly difficult, but I do have a recommendation for you, and that is The Vicar of Bullhampton. This is a really interesting Anthony Trollope novel that has sort of three strands to it, one of which is a love triangle, one of which is a dispute over land and the church, and one of which is a darker criminal story, which I think would appeal to you if you like Agatha Christie. But I also think the sort of small town, small community and church politics, like elements of The Vicar of Bullhampton, are also something that would appeal to you if you like Agatha Christie. They feel like the kind of thing that would crop up in Agatha Christie novels. So there you go, that's my recommendation. Next, if you like the works of Barbara Pym, I have a few recommendations for you, one of which is Barchester Towers and the Whole of the Barsetshire Chronicles. This is the second book in the Barsetshire Chronicles, which I spoke about earlier in terms of George Elliot. But I do think that the Barsetshire Chronicles, and especially Barchester Towers, are books that you would really enjoy if you like the works of Barbara Pym. In general, I think that if you like Barbara Pym, you will really like Anthony Trollope, and vice versa. I feel like they have lots of themes in common and a sense of like a wit in common and a sort of like coziness, but also sometimes darkness. So yeah, I feel like they are two authors that go quite well together, and I think you will like the Barsetshire Chronicles if you like Barbara Pym. I think the sort of like small town drama and gossip, and people talking about each other behind their backs and all the church politics, like I think all of that is something you will enjoy if you like Barbara Pym. But I do have one other recommendation for Barbara Pym too, which is a standalone novel, and that is Rachel Ray, which is a story of a young woman who meets and kind of maybe falls in love with a young man who works at the local brewery, but her mother and sister are quite suspicious of this young man. And Rachel's older sister, who is very religious, basically believes that it is sort of morally wrong for young women and young men to speak too much together. She is very suspicious of Rachel's possible suitor. And there's something about Rachel Ray and the sort of small town judgmentalness, and the sort of like quiet lives of lower middle class women trying to be respectable. That also makes me think of Barbara Pym. So I feel like if you like Barbara Pym, you'll probably like Rachel Ray. And then if you like the author Edith Wharton, I would like to recommend you Can You Forgive Her, which is the first book in the Palliser series. I know I have already recommended Can You Forgive Her for another prompt. I did try to give as many sort of different books as possible, but I just feel like Can You Forgive Her is a book you would like if you like Edith Wharton. I think maybe it's the character of Alice Vavasor, the central heroine of Can You Forgive Her, and the sort of complicated nature of her character, her unlikability, but also her likability, the fact that, you know, the sort of title of the book is, you know, Can You Forgive Her? Can you forgive Alice for the way she behaves in this novel? I feel like all of that just makes me think of Edith Wharton and the kinds of characters she writes about. So I feel like if you like Edith Wharton, you'll probably like Can You Forgive Her? Then finally, to wrap up this video, I have two Anthony Trollope books to recommend you if you love Anthony Trollope, which I know sounds a bit silly, but Anthony Trollope wrote 47 books. He wrote so many books, and it can be quite hard to know where to go next with his work. got books of his to try, and there are 2 novels by him that are a bit less commonly known, that are a bit more underrated, that I feel are like really super quintessentially Anthony Trollope books that if you like Anthony Trollope, you will really like. And if you like Anthony Trollope, you should prioritise and read, you know, sooner rather than later. And they are Isla's Angel, which I mentioned earlier, and Ralph the Heir. Isla's Angel I've spoken about already. It's a story of 2 sisters and their different love stories. And it's just very quintessentially Anthony Trollope and just like a wonderful, delightful comfort read, just that brought me so much joy. And then Ralph the Heir is another like really quintessentially Anthony Trollope novel that I love very much, and it is a bit underrated. I don't hear it spoken about as much, but I think it's wonderful. It tells the story of 2 different men, both called Ralph Newton, one of whom is the legitimate heir to his uncle's estate, and the other of whom is the illegitimate son of that uncle. So he cannot inherit the estate because he's illegitimate, so he is not Ralph the heir. The other Ralph is the heir. And we're following these 2 men as well as a group of 3 women who live together and everything that goes on between them. It's just a really like wonderful, quintessentially Anthony Trollope novel with some inheritance disputes, with some love triangles, with some wonderfully like charming moments, but also some sadder moments, and it's just great, and I love it very much. So if you have enjoyed the Anthony Trollope that you've read so far, I highly recommend Ralph the Heir and Isla's Angel. And that is all. I hope this video hasn't been too long, and I hope this has been a useful guide to various Anthony Trollope books you might enjoy if you like various different authors. As I said, I have a few more Anthony Trollope videos to come over the next few weeks, one of which will be a sort of Anthony Trollope Q&A or FAQ, I suppose. So if anyone has any questions about Anthony Trollope or anything to do with his work, do leave them down below and I will add them to my list for the FAQ. Otherwise, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.